Welcome to the lectures of the QAnon-park on Capitol Hill in Austria. I will do some lectures from The Theatre and the Plague by Mr. Antonin Artaud, a famous French theatre maker. The archives of the little town of Cagliari in Sardinia contain the account of an astonishing historical fact. One night, at the end of April or the beginning of May 1720, about 20 days before the arrival at Marseille of the Grand Saint-Antoine, a vessel whose landing coincided with the most amazing outbreak of the plague in that city's memory, Saint-Remy, the Viceroy of Sardinia, whose reduced monarchical responsibilities had perhaps sensitized him to the most pernicious of viruses, had a particularly afflicting dream. He saw himself infected by the plague. He dreamed it was ravaging the whole of his tiny state. Beneath such a scourge, all social forms disintegrate. Order collapses. He observes every infringement of morality, every psychological disaster. He hears his body fluids murmuring within him, tongue falling in a dizzying collapse of tissue. His organs grow heavy and gradually turn to carbon. But is it too late to avert the scourge? Even destroyed, even annihilated, organically pulverized and consumed to his very marrow, he knows we do not die in our dreams. That our will operates even in absurdity, even in the negation of possibility, even in the transmutation of the lies from which truth can be remade. Ooh, he wakes up. All these rumors about the plague, these miasmas of a virus from the Orient, he will know how to keep them away now. The Grand Saint-Antoine, a month out of Beirut, asks for permission to dock at Cagliari. The Viceroy replies with an insane order, an order considered irresponsible, absurd, idiotic, and despotic by the public and by his own staff. He hastily dispatches a pilot's boat and some men to the ship, which he presumes contaminated, with orders that the Grand Saint-Antoine tack about immediately and make full sail away from the town, under threat of being sunk by cannon fire. War against the plague. The autocrat was not going to waste any time. The particular strength of the influence which this dream exerted upon him should be remarked in passing, since it permitted him, in spite of the sarcasms of the crowd and the skepticism of his followers, to persevere in the ferocity of his orders, trespassing because of it not only upon the rights of man, but upon the sinless respect for human life and upon all sorts of national and international conventions, which, in the face of death, are no longer relevant. In any case, the ship continued on its course, landed at Leghorn, and entered the Marseille roadstead, where it was permitted to unload its cargo. The harbor authorities of Marseille have not kept a record of what happened to its plague-ridden cargo. What became of its crew is more or less known. Those who did not die of the plague disappeared and dispersed to different countries. The Grand Saint-Antoine did not bring the plague to Marseille. It was already there. And particular recrudescence, but its centers had been successfully localized. The plague brought by the Grand Saint Antoine was the Oriental plague, the original virus. And it is from its approach and diffusion in the city that the particularly dreadful and widespread flaring up of the epidemic dates. This inspires certain thoughts. This plague, which seems to reactivate a virus, was of itself capable of inflicting equally virulent damage. All of the crew, the captain alone did not catch the plague. Furthermore, it does not appear that the newly arrived victims had even ever been in direct contact with the others, confined as they were to close quarters. The Grand Saint Antoine, which passes within shouting range of Cagliari in Sardinia, does not deposit the plague there. But the Viceroy gathers certain emanations from it in a dream. For it cannot be denied that between the Viceroy and the plague, a palpable communication, however subtle, was established. And it is too easy and explains nothing to limit the communication of such a disease to contagion by simple contact. But these relations between Saint-Remy and the plague, strong enough to liberate themselves as images in his dream, are all the same not strong enough to infect him with the disease. In any case, the town of Cagliari, learning some time later that the ship turned from its shores by the despotic will of his viceroy, its miraculously unenlightened viceroy, was at the source of the great epidemic of Marseille, recorded the fact into its archives, where it can be found today. In 1880 or so, a French doctor by the name of Yersin, working on some cadavers of Indo-Chinese natives who had died of the plague, isolated one of those round-headed, short-tailed tadpoles which only the microscope can reveal, and called it the plague microbe. Personally, I regard this microbe only as a smaller, infinitely smaller material element which appears at some moment in the development of the virus, but which is in no way accounts for the plague. And I should like this doctor to tell me why all the great plagues, with or without virus, have a duration of 5 months, after which their virulence abates, and how the Turkish ambassador was passing through Languedoc towards the end of 1720 was able to draw an imaginary line from Nice through Avignon and Toulouse to Bordeaux, marking the limit of the scourge's geographical extension, a line which events proved to be accurate. From all this emerges the spiritual physiognomy of a disease whose laws cannot be precisely defined, and whose geographical origin it would be idiotic to attempt to determine, for the Egyptian plague is not the Oriental plague, which is not that described by Hippocrates, which is not that of Syracuse, nor of Florence, nor the Black Death, which accounted for 50 million lives in medieval Europe. No one can say why the plague strikes the coward who flees it and spares the degenerate who gratifies himself on the corpses. Why distance, chastity, solitude are helpless against the attacks of the scourge? And why a group of debaucheers isolating themselves in the country like Boccaccio with his 2 well-stocked companions and 7 women as lustful as they were religious can calmly wait for the warm days when the plague withdraws, and why in a nearby castle transformed into a citadel with a cordon of armed men to forbid all entry, the plague turned the garrison and all the occupants into corpses, and spares only the armed men exposed to contagion. Who can also explain why the military cordon sanitaire, which Mehmet Ali established toward the end of the last century on the occasion of an outbreak of the Egyptian plague, effectively protected convents, schools, prisons, and palaces, and why numerous epidemics of a plague with all the characteristic symptoms of the Oriental plague could suddenly break out in medieval Europe in places having no contact whatever with the Orient. From these peculiarities, these mysteries, these contradictions, and these symptoms, we must construct the spiritual physiognomy of a disease, which progressively destroys the organism, like a pain, which, as it intensifies, deepens, multiplies its resources and means of access at every level of sensibility. But from this spiritual freedom with which the plague develops, without rats, without microbes, and without contact, can be deduced the somber and absolute action of a spectacle which I shall attempt to analyze. Once the plague is established in a city, the regular forms collapse. There is no maintenance of roads and sewers, no army, no police, no municipal administration. Pyres are lit at random to burn the dead, which, with whatever means are available. Each family wants to have its own, of course. Then, wood, space, and flame itself growing rare, there are family foods around the pyres, soon followed by a general flight, for the corpses are too numerous. The dead already clog the streets in ragged pyramids gnawed at by animals around the edges. The stench rises in the air like a flame. Entire streets are blocked by the piles of dead. Then the houses open, and the delirious victims, their minds crowded with hideous visions, spread howling through the streets. The disease that ferments in their viscera and circulates throughout their entire organism discharges itself in a tremendous cerebral explosion. Other victims, without lupus, delirium, pain, or ash, examine themselves proudly in the mirror in splendid health, as they think, and then fall dead, with their shaving mugs in their hands, full of scorn for other victims. Of the poisonous, thick, bloody streams, color of agony and opium, which gush out of the corpses, strange personages pass, dressed in wax, with noses long as sausages and eyes of glass, mounted on a kind of Japanese sandal, made of double wooden tablets, one horizontal in the form of a soul, the other vertical, to keep them from the contaminated fluids, chanting absurd litanies that cannot prevent them from sinking into the furnace in their turn. These ignorant doctors betray only their fear and their childishness. The dregs of the population, apparently immunized by their frenzious greed, enter the open houses and pillage riches they know will serve no purpose or profit. And at that moment, the theater is born. The theater, i.e. an immediate, gratuitousness-provoking acts without use and without profit. The last of the living are in frenzy. The obedient and virtuous son kills his father. The chaste man performs sodomy upon his neighbors. The leeching becomes pure. The miser throws his gold in handfuls out of the window. The warrior hero sets fire to the city he once risked his life to save. The dandy decks himself out in his finest clothes and promenades before the charneled houses. Neither the idea of absence, of sanctions, nor that of imminent death suffices to motivate acts so gratuitously absurd on the part of men who did not believe death could end anything. And how explain the surge of erotic fever among the recovered victims, who instead of fleeing the city, remain where they are, trying to wrench a criminal pleasure from the dying or even the dead, half crushed in the pile of corpses where chance has lodged them? But if a mighty scourge is required to make this frenetic gratuitousness show itself, and if this scourge is called the plague, then perhaps we can determine the value of this gratuitousness in relation to our total personality, the state of the victim who dies without material destruction, with all the stigmata of an absolute and almost abstract disease upon him, is identical with the state of an actor, entirely penetrated by feelings that do not benefit or even relate to his real condition. Everything in the physical aspect of the actor, as in that of the victim of the plague, shows that life has reacted to the paroxysm, and yet nothing has happened. Between the victim of the plague, who runs in shrieking pursuit of his visions, and the actor in pursuit of his feelings, between the man who invents for himself personages he could never have imagined without the plague, creating them in the midst of an audience of corpses and delirious lunatics, and the poet who inopportunely invents characters, entrusting them to a public equally inert or delirious, there are other analogies which confirm the only truth that count and locate the action of the theater, like that of the plague, on the level of a veritable epidemic. But whereas the images of the plague occurring in relation to a powerful state of physical disorganization are like the last volleys of a spiritual force that is exhausting itself, the images of poetry in the theater are a spiritual force that begins its trajectory in the senses and does without reality altogether. Once launched upon the fury of his task, an actor requires infinitely more power to keep from committing a crime than a murderer needs courage to complete his act. And it is here, in its very graciousness, that the action and effect of a feeling in the theater appears infinitely more valid than that of a feeling fulfilled in life. Compared with the murderous fury which exhausts itself, that of the tragic actor remains enclosed within a perfect circle. The murderous fury has accomplished an act, discharged itself, and loses contact with the force that inspired it, but can no longer sustain it. That of the actor has taken a form that negates itself to just the degree it frees itself and dissolves into universality. Extending this spiritual image of the plague, we can comprehend the troubled body fluids of the victim as the material aspect of a disorder, which in other contexts is equivalent to the conflicts, struggles, cataclysms, and debacles of lives afford us, our lives afford us. And just as it is not impossible that the unavailing despair of the lunatic screaming in an asylum can cause the plague by a sort of reversibility of feelings and images, one can similarly admit that the external events, political conflicts, natural cataclysms, the order of revolution and the disorder of war, by occurring in the context of the theater, discharge themselves into the sensibility of an audience with all the force of an epidemic. In the city of God, St. Augustine complains of this similarity between the action of the plague that kills without destroying the organs and the theater, which, without killing, provokes the most mysterious alterations in the mind. And not only an individual, but an entire populace. No, he says, you are ignorant that these plays, sinful spectacles, were not established in Rome by the wishes of men, but by the order of your gods. It would be more reasonable to render divine honors into Scipio than to such gods. Surely they are not worthy of their pontiff. In order to appease the plague that killed bodies, your gods commanded in their honor these plagues, and your pontiff, wishing to avoid this plague that corrupts souls, opposes the construction of the stage itself. If there still remains among you sufficient trace of intelligence to prefer the soul to the body, choose what deserves your reverence. For the strategy of the evil spirits, foreseeing that the contagion would end with the body, seized joyfully upon this occasion to introduce a much more dangerous scourge among you, one that attacks not bodies, but customs. In fact, such is the blindness, such the corruption produced in the soul by plagues, that even in these late times, those whom this fatal passion possessed, who had escaped from the sack of Rome and taken refuge to Carthage, passed each day at the theater, priding themselves on their delirious enthusiasm for the actors. It is useless to give precise reasons for this contagious delirium. It would be like trying to find reasons why our nervous system, after a certain period, responds to the vibrations of the subtlest music and is eventually somehow modified by it. And in a lasting way. First of all, we must recognize that the theater, like the play, is a delirium and is communicative. The mind believes what it sees. It does what it believes. That is the secret of fascination. Nor does St. Augustine's text question for one moment the reality of this fascination. However, there are conditions to be rediscovered in order to engender in the mind a spectacle capable of fascinating it. And this is not a simple matter of art. For if the theater is like the plague, it is not only because it affects important collectivities and upsets them in an identical way. In the theater, as in the plague, there is something both victorious and vengeful. We are aware that the spontaneous conflagration which the plague lights wherever it passes is nothing else than an immense liquidation. A social disaster so far-reaching, an organic disorder so mysterious, this overflow of vices, this total exorcism which passes and presses and impels the soul to its utmost, all indicate the presence of a state which is nevertheless characterized by extreme strength, and in which all the powers of nature are freshly discovered at the moment when something essential is going to be accomplished. The plague technique takes images that are dormant, a latent disorder, and suddenly extends them into the most extreme gestures. The theater also takes gestures and pushes them as far as they will go. Like the blade, it reforges the chain between what is and what is not, because between the virtuality of the possible and what already exists in materialized nature, it recovers the notion of symbols and archetypes, which act like silent laws, restless leaps of the heart, summons of the lymph, inflammatory images thrust into our allegedly wicked heads. The theater restores us as our dormant conflicts and all their powers, and gives these powers names we hail as symbols. And behold, before our eyes is fought a battle of symbols, one charging against another in an impossible melee. For there can be theater only from the moment when the impossible really begins, and when the poetry which occurs on the stage sustains and superheats the realized symbols. These symbols, the sign of ripe powers previously held in servitude and unavailable to reality, burst forth in the guise of incredible images which give freedom of the city and of existence to acts that are by nature hostile to the life of societies. In the true theater, a play stirs the senses, repose, frees the repressed unconscious, incites a kind of virtual revolt, which, moreover, can have its full effect only if it remains virtual. If it remains virtual. And imposes on the assembled collectivity an attitude that is both difficult and heroic. Thus, in Ford's "'Tis Party She's a Whore," from the moment the curtain rises, we see to our utter stupefacción a creature flung into an insolent vindication of incest, exerting all the vigor of his youthful consciousness to proclaim and justify it. He does not waver an instant, does not hesitate a minute, and thereby shows of how little account are all the barriers that could be opposed to him. He is heroically criminal and ostentatiously heroic. Everything drives him in his direction, inflames his enthusiasm. He recognizes neither the earth nor heaven, only the force of his convulsive passion, to which the rebellious and equally heroic passion of Annabella does not fail to respond. I weep, she says, not with remorse, but for fear I shall not be able to satisfy my passion. They are both forgers, hypocrites, and liars for the sake of their superhuman passion, which laws obstruct and condemn, but which they will put beyond the law. Vengeance for vengeance and crime for crime. When we believe them threatened, hunted down, lost, when we are ready to pity them as victims, then they reveal themselves ready to render destiny threat for threat and blow for blow. With them, we proceed from excess to excess and vindication to vindication. Annabella is captured, convicted of adultery and incest, trampled upon, insulted, dragged by the hair, and we are astonished to discover that far from seeking a means of escape, she provides her executioner still further and sings out in a kind of obstinate heroism. It is the absolute condition of revolt. It is an exemplary case of love without respite, which makes us, the spectators, gasp with anguish at the idea that nothing will ever be able to stop it. If we desire an example of absolute freedom in revolt, Ford's Annabella provides this poetic example, bound up with the image of absolute danger. And when we tell ourselves we have reached the paroxysm of horror, blood, and flouting laws, of poetry which consecrates revolt, we are obliged to advance still further into an endless vertigo. But ultimately, we tell ourselves there is a vengeance. There is death for such audacity and such irresistible crime. But there is no such thing. Giovanni the lover, inspired by the passion of a great poet, puts himself beyond vengeance, beyond crime. But still another crime, one that is indescribably passionate, beyond threats, beyond horror, but an even greater horror, one which overthrows at one and the same time law, morality, and all those who dare set themselves up as administrators of justice. A trap is cleverly set. A great banquet is given where among the guests hired ruffians and spies are to be hidden, ready at the first signal to throw themselves upon him. But this hero, cornered, lost, and inspired by love, will let no one pass sentence on this love. You want, he seems to say, my love's flesh and blood? Very well. I will throw this love in your face and shower you with this blood. For you are incapable of rising to its height. And he kills his beloved and tears out her heart, as if to feast upon in the middle of a banquet where he himself is the one whom the guests have hoped to devour. And before being executed, he manages to kill his rival, his sister's husband, who has dared to come between him and his love, and dispatches him in a final combat, which then appears as his own spasm of agony. Like the plague, the theater is a formidable call to the forces that impel the mind by example to the source of its conflict. And it is evident that Ford's passionate example merely symbolizes a still greater and absolutely essential task. By terrorizing apparition of evil, which in the mysteries of Eloises were produced in its pure, truly revealed form, corresponds to the dark hour of certain ancient tragedies which all true theater must recover. If the essential theater is like the plague, it is not because it is contagious, but because like the plague, it is the revelation, the bringing forth, the exteriorization of a death of latent cruelty by means of which all the perverse possibilities of the mind, whether of an individual or of peoples, are localized. Like the plague, the theater is the time of evil, the triumph of dark powers that are nourished by a power even more profound until extinction. In the theater, as in the plague, there is a kind of strange sun, a light of abnormal intensity, by which it seems that the difficult and even the impossible suddenly becomes our normal element. And Ford's play, like all true theater, is within the radiance of this strange sun. His Annabella resembles the play's freedom, by means of which, from degree to degree, stage to stage, the victim swells his individuality and the survivor gradually becomes a grandiose and overwhelming being. We can now say that all true freedom is dark. I repeat, all true freedom is dark, and infallibly identified with sexual freedom, which is also dark, although we do not know precisely why. For it has been a long time since the Platonic eros, the procreative sense, the freedom of life, vanished beneath the somber veneer of the libido, which is identified with all that in dirty, abject, infamous, in the process of living and of throwing oneself headlong with a natural and impure vigor, with a perpetually renewed strength upon love. And that is why all the great myths are dark, so that one cannot imagine safe in an atmosphere of carnage, torture, and bloodshed all the magnificent fables which recount to the multitudes the first sexual division and the first carnage of essences that appeared in creation. The theater, like the plague, is in the image of this carnage and this essential separation. It releases conflicts, disengages powers, liberates possibilities, and if these possibilities and these powers are dark, it is the fault not of the plague, nor of the theater, but of life. We do not see that life as it is and as it has been fashioned for us provides many reasons for exaltation. It appears that by means of the plague, a gigantic abscess, as much moral as social, has been collectively drained. And then, like the plague, the theater has been created to drain abscesses collectively. Perhaps the theater's poison, injected into the social body, disintegrates, as St. Augustine said, but at least it does so as a plague, as an avenging scourge, a redeeming epidemic in which credulous ages have chosen to see the finger of God, and which is nothing but the application of a law of nature, whereby every gesture is counterbalanced by a gesture and every action by its reaction. The theater, like the plague, is a crisis, which is resolved by death or cure. And the plague is a superior disease, because it is a total crisis, after which nothing remains except death or an extreme purification. Similarly, the theater is a disease because it is the supreme equilibrium which cannot be achieved without destruction. It invites the mind to share a delirium which exalts its energies, and we can see, to conclude, that from the human point of view, the action of theater, like that of play, is beneficial. For impelling men to see themselves as they are, it causes the mask to fall, reveals the lie, the slackness, baseness, and hypocrisy of our world. It shakes off the asphyxiating inertia of matter, which invades even the clearest testimony of the senses, and in revealing to collectivities of men their dark power, their hidden force, it invites them to take, in the face of destiny, a superior and heroic attitude they would never have assumed without it. And the question we must now ask is whether in this slippery world, which is committing suicide without noticing it, there can be found a nucleus of men, and women of course, capable of imposing this superior notion of the theater, men and women, who will restore to all of us the natural and magic equivalent of the dogmas in which we do not longer believe.